This is Jeffrey Tucker of Brownstone Institute. I'm very pleased to welcome Andrew Lowenthal of liber.net and also of Brownstone Institute Working Group on Censorship. And today we're going to be talking about, what seems to be some cracks in the censorship industrial complex, maybe. And it relates in particular to the news concerning the Stanford University Internet Observatory. When I first heard about the Internet Observatory at the Stanford University, I got it in my head that there was this big, tall thing on a mountain with a telescope looking up into the heavens. maybe that's what comes to mind with the word observatory, but that's not what it is it?
Not as far as I understand. I haven't visited the offices, but I assume they're somewhere down a hallway to the left or to the right and through a door, and like many other academic institutions. But that said, their technological prowess was probably much more extensive than whatever offices they were inhabiting, and they certainly built a kind of panopticon / propaganda machinery that was, I think, vis-a-vis or in relation to the pandemic, probably amongst, if not the most advanced as regards social media.
We're talking about something other than just some agenda-driven people surfing the web, but there was more going on.
There was an observatory. It also had lasers, not just a dish to collect information, we could say.
Okay. Have you seen these models? Are you familiar with what they were doing?
I have. So maybe a little bit of background. I worked with Matt Taibbi on a part of the censorship. On part of the Twitter files that particularly looked at the Stanford Internet Observatory, namely the Election Integrity Partnership Project, and then the subsequent initiative that they did called the Virality Project. Virality Project specifically sought to combat what they considered to be anti-vaccine misinformation. It turned out within that remit, you can pretty much put anything, according to the Stanford Internet Observatory, including true stories of vaccine side effects. So if you can put true things inside misinformation, then basically you have license for anything. So that was one of the documents that was discovered through researching the Twitter files.
And they had no enforcement power. And quite frequently, when you see the Stanford Internet Observatory, over the last 6 months, for example, we've seen articles in, in national, but the usual suspects, National Public Radio, New York Times, and so on, celebrating the intrepid university researchers who are trying to help us understand more about what's going on the internet. And they're being mercilessly hounded by fire-breathing red state politicians. So that is the characterization that you're going to get from any mainstream source you read these days.
Absolutely. I was reading 4 or 5 articles today, NPR, Washington Post, that essentially that was the line, and they missed out one of the most important things, almost all of them, which relates to the enforcement question that you just put forth, which is that actually this initiative was started by the Department of Homeland Security and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So there's an email that was sent to a man called Graham Brookie, who leads an initiative called the Digital Forensics Research Lab, which is part of the Atlantic Council, saying we've just been, more or less says, we've just been contacted by the Department of Homeland Security and CISA to set up an election integrity partnership. So these two initiatives, Election Integrity Partnership and then Virality Project, which used exactly the same content flagging system, was actually an initiative that came out of the security state. And there are other emails within the Twitter files that Matt Taibbi has published that show that Twitter knew that the Department of Homeland Security had an affiliation to this initiative. So when emails were sent saying, we recommend you take this down, et cetera, sure, they were just recommendations, but there were recommendations that, at least in the case of Twitter, where they knew that there was a relationship to agencies that you could say had a pretty big stick. So they're not just a simple serving suggestion.
And the disinformation dozen comes out of this project?
Disinformation doesn't, say that 10 times, comes out of, the Center for Countering Digital Hate. So not specifically related, but certainly information sharing was happening between SIO and Center for Countering Digital Hate as well. They were both flagging content to Twitter and requesting takedowns, often targeting the same people, such as RFK Jr.
You have drawn out a kind of a map. First time I saw it, I couldn't believe what I was looking at, that you call the censorship industrial complex, which involves hundreds, if not thousands, of various, I guess you would call them cutouts, that are designed to launder censorship activities through what I've labeled shallow state civilian agencies. It's research centers, nonprofit organizations, NGOs, and using an Ivy University and hiring a series of researchers. It seems like an ideal way to accomplish this, because it seems as if it's just nothing other than research. But they weren't even academics, am I right?
Well, some of them were academics, but Renee DeResta, to my understanding, she was the research manager at SIO and led those two projects. She had no significant academic background. Her major achievement, I guess, that has become more famous, was that she was worked for the CIA. That was the way she was introduced by her boss, Alex Stamos, who was the director of the Stanford Internet Observatory. So that map was something that I, again, worked on with Matt Taibbi to find out who all these NGOs and academics and philanthropic organizations were and how they were connected to different parts of the government, et cetera, and how many of them are exactly cutouts and how many of them are kind of a mixed model would be kind of hard to work out. And actually the fact that it is a little bit hard to establish how much of it is organic and inorganic more generally and specifically within each entity is actually one of the ways that it works quite well, because there is disinformation out there. There is legitimate work, I would say, to be done countering disinformation. But a lot of this work focused on what they considered, what I sometimes call disinformation street crime, so disinformation that was, or so-called disinformation spread by ordinary people, and mostly neglects to focus on disinformation corporate crime. So that is the actual disinformation coming from the most powerful people, the government, and big business. And so they don't pick up on, if you get the shot, you can't get COVID and you can't spread it. They don't call out that misinformation or disinformation. They go around essentially combating things like tweets from Martin Kulldorff. It was actually one of the tweets that they picked up that then seemed to get him labeled on Twitter and then temporarily suspended. So they're really kind of punching down, you might actually say, for kind of which is actually heresy for kind of liberal NGO / academic world, but that's essentially what they were. What they were doing, policing the internet against the little people.
I'm trying to understand sort of how the model works. So you've got an industrial interest that doesn't like people trashing its product. Let's say a vaccine, and they're regulated by an agency, and the agency really enjoys the royalties from the industrial product, and it considers itself a partner with that industrial agency, and then that agency funds a kind of a purely external agent, NGO or university research center or something. They do the work, flag certain accounts, and then that information goes back to the agency, which is then shared with the company that's distributing the information, in this case, Twitter 1.0 or Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever. And then they all cooperate and taking it down gradually, thereby curating the internet of everything that runs contrary to what the agency's industrial partner wants. So this is, in other words, this is censorship. But it's laundered through so many different layers and levels that it's hard to track and figure out what's going on, right?
Yeah, totally. So I would say, one, there's two different agencies going on. So the agencies that are really overseeing this is DHS and CISA, whereas I imagine you would hope the agencies overseeing the kind of industrial products is the FDA or the CDC. You would know more there. Obviously, they work in close partnership. Yeah. In fact, SIO had Vivek Murthy, the U.S. Surgeon General, come and do talks for them and kind of participated in campaigns that the White House was also running to combat anti-vaccine misinformation. But yeah, the really key thing here is that this new kind of laundering system, this new kind of censorship by proxy, where the government works through NGOs and academia, and also I would say in partnership with large philanthropic organizations, essentially to kind of as a cover for the censorship to do the kind of things that often they say explicitly. There's literally a quote from Alex Stamos where he says essentially that the election integrity partnership was set up to do the kind of things that the government cannot do. But at the same time, you being more of an expert on the First Amendment than me, you cannot also proxy through a third party censorship. That is also significant encouragement. So we will see what happens in the Missouri v. Biden or Murthy v. Missouri, however you like to label it today, case that happens in the Supreme Court. Some people are a little bit less hopeful, but this stuff very much intersects with that case. In fact, they're named and documented quite significantly through that suit. Well, a lot of the discovery, a lot of the documents and details comes from that. It comes from the Twitter files, and it comes from the House Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government.
Yeah, the subject is frustrating because here we are now, I don't know, 10 minutes deep into our interview, and we're still sort of explaining the complexities of this whole thing. In the background here, we do have the First Amendment. And the First Amendment is widely understood to say government cannot shut you up. Government can't, go to the New York Times and say you can't do this. Unless there's some compelling interest.
I think,
but and so the what's at issue is not so much that, but this sort of privatization of these violations of the First Amendment, where it gets opaque and very murky. Who precisely is acting, which is part of the point of the structure, right?
I would say so, and I think a lot of people still understand it's kind of public opinion management in a kind of Iraq war kind of way. You influence NBC, you influence CNN, you influence Fox News, you influence the New York Times, etc. But that's a kind of 1.0 version. We're really into a completely new model, and I think that is one of the reasons why it took us quite a long time to really understand what was going on. That you couldn't really see the censorship. It's really, you just kind of shadow ban and kind of dial down a bit of Jay Bhattacharya, et cetera, and you just make, and it's really hard to actually see. So, it takes a little bit of time to talk through, but I think it's really, really important because if you don't have you need to build a new kind of heuristic or kind of shorthand for what this new censorship looks like so that we can see it more easily as it continues to be, rolled out.
This is one of the frustrating aspects of the oral arguments in Murphy, Missouri at Supreme Court is that these guys are hearing cases all day and they have to be masters of the universe on everything. And it seemed obvious to me, just reading through the oral arguments, that the justices themselves did not understand what was really at issue here. And you had cases where justices would ask plaintiffs things like, "Wait, are you saying that if you're the political appointee of the Department of Education that they can't, or the Department of Transportation, they can't call up the transportation reporter at the New York Times and say this is incorrect, you should report this instead?" And it was very frustrating because that's not really. I mean, that's maybe a piece of what's at issue, but the industrial machinery behind 21st century style censorship is a lot more complicated.
Absolutely, and that means we also have to have much better arguments as well, because it isn't as obvious. And so then there's this argument that gets rolled out. Oh well, the White House is just using the bully pulpit, and it's allowed to have opinion on these things, and yes, that's true, et cetera, but if you actually look then at the emails, they're absolutely egregious and essentially say, can we get moving on the process of getting this tweet removed? Like, that's not bully pulpit, especially when you have the enormous stick of the federal government. It's similar to the Stanford case at the moment, because you read some of the statement from Alex Stamos and Renee DiResta, and they're saying, these people who are, reporting about what we've been doing and investigating us through the House committee, they're attacking free inquiry and our rights to free speech. It's like, well, I don't remember free speech being using free speech to censor. I don't remember being a legitimate use of free speech. If someone can update me on that. You'd have to. I'm happy to kind of try and understand the argument.
And by the way, I hadn't really thought about this that much, but apparently it has been routine for decades, if not forever, for government officials to call directly reporters who are reporting the news and say, you should report this, not that. And that by itself is a little bit strange to me. I mean, it seems like, in all the arguments, I think one of the justices said, well, wait a minute, I used to work in this area and I called reporters all the time, but that seems like there's nothing wrong with that. But even that is a little strange to me. It seems like there ought to be some public record of that. But I don't know. We have to let the courts figure that one out.
Yeah, that's actually true. I mean, I would say I'm quite fine with a kind of senior official calling a newspaper, but I would agree that maybe has to be on the public record and it has to be available for anyone to review. And perhaps it is. I actually don't know.
I don't know.
But
anyway, that's not the issue. Now, let's just go back to the news concerning Stanford Internet Observatory. I guess just a couple of days ago, there was a report that was, it was skewed. It was like, oh, look, the bad Republicans have managed to attack the brilliant academic institution. Now Stanford's dismantling it. So I guess what happens here, so you've got these grants coming from the Department of Homeland Security, from CISA, you've got...
no grant that we know of that came direct. Well, the grants that probably happened was probably, and again, I don't have full confirmation on this, one of the partners, the University of Washington, Center for the Public, run by Kate Starbird, received a $3 million grant from the National Science Foundation. Yeah. It looks like that was used for the Virality Project. To my knowledge, it's not fully confirmed that was the case. Most of Stanford's money was private sector, and including the founding donation of $5 million came from Craig Newmark. That said, there's all these huge entanglements between the two, and I think one of the key things that about this kind of new system is that you try to limit the entanglements with the federal government as much as possible. That said, going through the University of Washington was probably a very big mistake, because another way that we know a lot about this system is because of all the FOIAing that people like Li Fang and Matt Taibbi have been doing on the University of Washington, because it is a public university. There's lots of emails and documents that have been revealed also via that, and Kate Starbird also has a very strong relationship with CISA as well. So there's still quite a lot to untangle, I would say, in terms of how all of this exactly works. And you would think that, well, we should know by now, but it is that complicated that we don't entirely know. And this was also one of the issues, was that Stanford Internet Observatory was resisting handing over basically the details of their content flagging system to this House committee, essentially until they basically took it down to the wire, and then they finally handed it over. And that's also what revealed a lot of the information of these, particularly in relation to the Election Integrity Partnership, these very, very direct recommendations of, you should take this down, you should take that down as well.
One of the things that Elon Musk discovered when he took over Twitter is that a vast number of employees were themselves in a kind of a revolving door relationship with these various private sector cutouts, NGOs, and even government agencies themselves.
I would almost say especially government agencies.
Okay.
In fact, to my knowledge, the former FBI officials had their own Slack channel within Twitter. And of course, the Deputy General Counsel of Twitter was Jim Baker, who was formerly the General Counsel of the FBI. So there were no shortage of relationships between the government and social media. And I think what we've seen is essentially a kind of slow capturing of both big tech, but also civil society by government agencies. They've essentially crept into all of these spaces and pivoted it away from free expression, which was actually the remit a lot of most of these NGOs and academic research institutions, was to defend that, and made them do this 180 towards censorship. And the mechanism for that 180 has been countering disinformation, countering hate, protecting public health, etc. So all these kind of safetiest justifications have really been the Trojan horse through which this new kind of culture of censorship has happened, and that you've got buy-in from these civil society actors that in times gone by would have been out, defending Assange, defending Snowden, saying information wants to be free, et cetera, et cetera. And now they're like, oh, the internet's really dangerous. Actually, we really need to work with the government to get a little bit safer.
Yeah. Am I misremembering, and please correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I have a vague sense that do we have some documentation that some of the employees of Twitter 1.0 were actually being paid, or at least their salary is being compensated by the FBI?
Yes, because there were so many requests by the FBI that I think there was a kind of compensation for like, okay, we've taken so much of your time to do this that you need to have a certain amount of compensation. I mean, I would probably be asking for some money as well, but you can, given the number of requests, but you can see how a kind of mutually beneficial relationship might emerge if you're just like, oh, can you just have a look at this? I'll shoot you a $5 if you can tell me a little bit more. So it's and imagine, like, obviously this relationship was dismantled, or at least, well, we don't really know. It was modified at Twitter, certainly, but it probably wasn't at all of the rest of the social media.
No, for certain. I mean, you know this. Facebook is closed. Google is not the same company as it was 5 years ago. LinkedIn, is still is dramatically different from what it used to be, and everybody is self-censoring now. So among all mainstream social media, and I would say just generally digital information sector themselves, X remains the only one that's partially free now, and which is very scary, meaning that the very institution of free speech itself is all resting on the shoulders of one.
Well, I would say of the kind of mega platforms, you could probably say, yes, only one is partially free. And it's also interesting that you also said partially, because I think that it's not that X is perfect either. I think where the really free spaces are still in these kind of smaller sites. Obviously, you don't get the same level of audience on those spaces.
Well,
but I think we need thousands, to my mind, of independent media spaces to pop up, and many of them are there. But what you can't get is the network effects. You can't get scale. You can't get a tweet that gets 1 million or 2 million or 5 million or more views, and that is what makes
so
these
Andrew,
mega
thank you for pointing that out, because I have the hardest time explaining this to people. End users and even on the production side of information do not understand that point that you just made. They're completely oblivious to it. They think that because they can post something on Rumble or 4chan or whatever, that therefore you have free speech. They do not understand the scaling difference here. And I have to say that I was in the driver's seat, I guess, or the observer's seat, a front row seat, I guess you would say, of one post that was put up in 2020 that at Facebook that inadvertently passed the fact checkers. We haven't even got into that layer. And I promise I'm not going to keep you forever. I just want to mention this real quick point that I got through the fact checkers one time, and Zuckerberg, or the algorithms at Facebook, actually either permissioned my post or boosted it. And I've never seen traffic like that in my life. It was just millions and millions and millions of views pouring in. It was like opening the window. You know, I mean, I've never seen in my life. I've never seen anything like it. And then once they figured out, you know, this was a mistake. I mean, the algorithms got better. Then it all, you know, shut down again. So I got a brief look at the difference between, you know, a piece of information that has, you know, a huge impact on the public mind versus that which is just hanging out in some venue somewhere. You know, that is.
And again, I think we need these new heuristics of like, what is this new system? How does it work? Because censorship often feels like a kind of binary thing. You're either you can see it or you can't. I mean, one of the things I say to people is, you know, if you put a paper bag over my head, am I censored? It's like, okay, you can still speak, but it doesn't. Not as many people are going to hear you. Is that censorship? I mean, maybe we need different language and a different word.
No,
because
I agree with that. Because it is about control of the public mind, and it really matters because, you know, your mom has apps on her phone, and they're not Rumble. You know, they're CNN and Facebook, right? So, you know, I mean, this is
actually, speaking of that, though, the time I understood that things had really gone very interesting was that my mother had pointed me to the interview between Joe Rogan and I think it was Peter McCullough
and Robert Malone, probably.
And I was like, how does and that was like, and then that was right just before, like a day or two before this massive crackdown on Joe Rogan. And I was like, my mother probably had never heard of Joe Rogan until that point. And she had gotten hold of the Joe Rogan, Robert Malone conversation. And I was like, oh, wow, this has really gotten out. And obviously they panicked dramatically after that.
And Robert Malone is
like, we need to stop Joe Rogan and get him off the internet.
Yeah, and Robert Malone is well spoken, erudite, and brilliant. But he's also one of the last I would say, like dissident scientists to be sort of grandfathered into mainstream public awareness, because after that it just completely shut down.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Now, on this Stanford case, what is your understanding of what happened to the Stanford Internet Laboratory? They just had the budget cut, and so they switched out the management, or what's taking place?
So, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different aspects to it from my reading of it. One is that they had trouble. Well, the Washington Post story, I believe, suggested they had trouble getting more money. I'm not surprised, which means actually some of the journalism is doing its job. So they're dialing down to 3 people. So it's not that it's completely shut down as well, but it seems to be getting absorbed into a larger department. But at the same time, I think it's a little bit of spin, because really the fact that Alex Stamos and Rene DeResta, who are really the full kind of brains and leadership behind it, are departing, it essentially means that it is really not anything like what it was before. The other thing was that there are multiple suits in terms of the Civil Liberties Alliance, and there's a second one by a former Trump aide whose name escapes me. America First Legal, I think it's from, where people are getting sued individually as well. So I think that all of the scrutiny, House committee as well, has taken a toll. So which is very interesting and very good to know that actually accountability is possible. I mean, some people might say, okay, sure, they're going to go somewhere else. Alex Stamos is already working with Chris Krebs, who used to head up CISA. So, that's a obviously very cozy, revolving door there as well. I'm sure Rene DeResta will not have too much trouble finding.
She's not going to go to work for the Palo Alto bakery company.
No, she's not. You will not see. She will not be making your coffee anytime soon, but one day perhaps. But I mean, I think what this also tells us is that some accountability is possible, and it's a small victory, but I think it's also very, very significant.
Well, what's frustrating though, Andrew, is that you could see part of the purpose of this kind of structure to make these cutouts disposable once they come to public attention,
It's true, but I think at the same time it does a certain amount of damage. I mean, the fact that this institute is falling by the wayside, they've done a lot of damage to the anti-disinformation research space. So I imagine there's a lot of people out there who are sure kind of crying and wishing, oh, this is really bad, we're under attack. I think there are other people probably there going, oh, well, looks like they might have done something a little bit wrong, and they've damaged some of our actual legitimate research work. And actually one of the points that I'm about to publish a Substack post on this issue is that one of the big failures was that academic self-regulation. You really should be going, there are some bad actors in our space that are not really doing anti-disinformation. They're doing censorship, and the self-regulatory mechanisms, because the conversation is so broken and because the space is so corrupt and there's so much money pushing people in the wrong direction, all of that kind of added up to no one actually saying, oh, the emperor's got no clothes. Do you really think this is what this field of research should be doing? It looks a little bit like censorship to me. And essentially no one from that space, I would probably be one of the extremely few people from that space, because I used to run an progressive NGO that did a certain amount of disinformation work. No one said anything. And so these people just kind of kept rolling on and on and on and on and on. And here we are. This is where we've arrived. So hopefully this is also the beginning of a reckoning for that.
But beginning of a reckoning, but it's far from impactful on. I mean, there are so many of these organizations. I'll just mention to you quickly. I hope this is not a problem for me to mention this, but NewsGuard has been after. NewsGuard is another one of these things, right? I mean, it's like they have subscription services. They send out to big tech. Look, we're gonna make sure that you don't amplify bad content, and that you have great deal of integrity, and that will cause you to attract good advertising. And so subscribe to our services, and so then they rate news sources based on, and this is one of, I don't know, several dozen of these things, right? But they came after me a couple of days ago. They've been going after me for 3 years, and I used to tangle with them all the time until I realized it was pointless. No matter what I said, they were going to ding us anyway. But they came after me a couple of days ago, and they said, "Hey, how dare you say that the Wuhan lab was doing gain-of-function research, and how dare you say that SARS-CoV-2 was likely manufactured in a lab?" And I'm reading this email thinking, you're taking issue with what is probably qualifies as conventional knowledge now. I
mean, the 2021. What are you? Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I mean, New York Times even had a piece last week, or this week, last week, saying, I think it was something like 5 reasons the virus probably came from a lab.
Yeah.
So maybe news guys contacted the New York Times as well.
I don't know, but at some point you just have to delete these things. It's all just ridiculous. Well, anyway, I suppose this is it's good, mildly good news and interesting. But the most important thing that my takeaway is that people need to develop a more sophisticated understanding of how censorship actually works in a digital age, with so many layers and so much going on out there. This is not the 18th century anymore, and First Amendment is being violated. The spirit of the First Amendment, anyway, through surreptitious and very complicated means. So I commend you for your intrepid journalism and work on this, Andrew. Thank you. Is there anything else you want to say?
Thank you. No, I would just echo exactly what you said. We need a new shorthand to understand what's going on, so that we can catch this stuff much earlier. There's a great deal of work to be done.
Yeah, and you're at liber-net and
liber-net.org.
liber-net. .org, liber-net.org. Okay.
liber-net.org. That one costs about $10,000, but we'll see how the fundraising goes.
Well, you could always write CISA or the Department of Homeland Security and say.
We're not on the best terms.
Thank you, Andrew. All the best.
Cheers. Thank you.